Oh, Patrick, your summary of Tristan und Isolde is just wonderful. I've seen the opera many times, but your presentation of it has enriched my understanding.
Why, thank you, Paul, and if the rest of you also want to be so enriched, please check out my episode on Wagner and musical blue balls. In the meantime, welcome to The Great Everything, the world's only podcast dedicated to art, donuts, and transformation. I'm Patrick, a former finance lawyer who saw the light and quit to dedicate my life to culture and philosophy, the greatest self-improvement tools of all. Just as a reminder, with these little culture bites, I'm not necessarily expecting any of you to go out and actually listen to the piece of music I'm talking about or read from the philosopher I'm talking about. The main point here is to be aware of who these people are and where they fit into the history of our culture. Because understanding these artists and these thinkers and their significance helps us get a better idea of the narrative, of the trajectory of our art, our culture, and our history as a human species. And if we understand how we got here, we have a better chance of understanding how we can move forward. So with that in mind, please enjoy today's Culture Bite. Oh, and please leave a review, share, add me on Tweetster, etc. Good morning! On this day in 1913, a few hundred Parisians walked into the Champs-Élysées theatre to watch the premiere of a new ballet by the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. The ballet was called the Rite of Spring, and when it premiered, it was so new and so radical that it caused the full-fledged riot. The thing I like to talk about here on The Great Everything is game changers. You know, those things that come out of the blue and do something utterly crazy, breaking with the past. And that change, that innovation is so brutal and so violent that nobody who comes after it can ignore it. In music, there's a ton of such game changers. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was a big one. If you want to know more about that one, check out the episodes tab because I did a full mega episode explaining it. The Ninth Symphony changed 19th century music forever. But the next big game changer in music was Stravinsky's ballet, The Rite of Spring. This piece of music, but we can really call it performance art, was so radical that the audience at the premiere didn't even know what to make of it. So they beat each other up instead. See, classical music, even the most avant-garde, comes with a set of expectations. It's still a civilized music for civilized people. And The Rite of Spring isn't that at all. It's an assault on the senses, it's primal, it's carnal. It's so sexual that earlier I described it as orgiastic. It's a ballet about the mysterious creative power of spring and the prehistoric tribal rituals that celebrate its arrival. The dances in the ballet are all about fertility, with all that entails, and they culminate in the human sacrifice of a virgin who is danced to death. So as you can imagine, the subject matter itself was pretty scandalous for the time. All these raunchy dancers dressed up as ancient Russian cavemen wearing animal skins, humping each other, and then you've got human sacrifice and stuff like that. But in a way, the music itself is even more scandalous. See, Stravinsky wanted to recreate the brutal sexual environments of Bronze Age Russia, so the music had to feel ancient and primordial, but also new, because prehistoric music wouldn't have been influenced by all the music people would be familiar with in the early 20th century, so it had to be completely separate from any pre-existing tradition. You know, when you see a piece of contemporary art that is just such a departure from the norm, it doesn't even feel like art anymore. Maybe it just feels vulgar, like a fuck you to the whole art form. I mentioned that's how early critics might have reacted to Jackson Pollock's paintings. I also imagine it would have made some people in the field angry. Now imagine you're a cultured musical connoisseur in 1913 and you're going to the Ballet Russe, one of the most civilized activities you can think of, and what you hear is this. Now, we're used to this these days, because it's the basis for about 80 years of film music. But at the time, it would have felt like a provocation by Stravinsky. So people got angry. The audience members started pushing and shoving each other, throwing things at the orchestra. They started yelling and booing. One guy challenged another guy to a duel at a classical music concert. Nobody was killed, fortunately, but the next day, of course, this riot was all anyone was talking about. You know, although on the night Stravinsky will have been mortified by this furious reaction, you can't help but feel that he somehow made it. The Rite of Spring is brutal, and it's sexual, and even today it feels radical and new, almost dangerous. And in trying to recreate that primal feeling of prehistoric times, Stravinsky clearly tapped into something primal within his audience. Their visceral reaction to the Rite of Spring is a testament to Stravinsky's ultimate success. So, a piece of music that sparked a riot. In thinking about the Rite of Spring, I started to wonder whether there was any piece of art today, in our age of nothing is normal, so everything is normal, if there's anything that today could provoke a similar reaction. Because we've become quite inured to depictions of violence and sex in films, in video games, even in music, so it's hard to imagine an album being released or a book being published that could provoke such a violent reaction. After all, we're kind of used to anything these days. But at the same time, we've seen violent protests break out at college campuses when certain famous authors have gone there to speak. I'm referring to Charles Murray, the author of The Bell Curve, who went to speak at an American university last year and, violence erupted. Now, you could make a distinction here. Charles Murray is a very controversial author, and he published this book, The Bell Curve, in which he talks about race and IQ, which is a very, very touchy subject. Politics, in all of our history, have stirred up passionate feelings and strong reactions because politics is closely linked to morality, to what you feel is right. So if someone disagrees with you in certain ways, it's difficult not to feel that they are just a bad person, and that would then trigger all these responses that we've seen on college campuses recently. But then thinking back to the Rite of Spring and the reaction that it elicited, can't we see parallels there? Isn't there something political in that too? Because the riot was provoked in no small measure by the fact that the ballet was depicting a highly sexualized instance of human sacrifice. So sex and violence, classic combo that pisses people off, right? And that feels like a moral reaction, not so different from the reaction one might have to someone whose politics and therefore morality one finds deeply despicable. So are there useful parallels to be drawn here between the riot breaking out at the Rite of Spring premiere and the kind of protests that erupt at college campuses when a Charles Murray goes to speak there? Or should we constrict this argument to the domain of art? Because there's a long history of controversial art being put on display, and the controversy usually revolves around one of two aspects. One is the classic "this isn't art" response. For some reason, the audience or the critic doesn't feel that the piece of music, the piece of art on display is adequately conforming to the philosophical or aesthetic principles that make that art form what it is. So you're going to get that kind of reaction with all kinds of art forms. You might find it with Stravinsky, where the weird rhythmic patterns just didn't seem to fit in with any of the established rules of music up to that point. Or you can find it in the visual arts, when artists start to move away from the classic ideal of figurative art, by which I mean just painting what you see as you see it, and they start moving along the spectrum towards the abstracts. Well, you can say starting with Impressionism, when the visuals start to get a bit more hazy, moving on to Cubism and Dada and Picasso, and then on to these powerful artistic statements like Marcel Duchamp and his The Fountain, which is basically just a urinal put there, which is making a philosophical statement about what art is and what its function should be. He's trying to remove the notion of what art should be from the question of, is this beautiful or not? So some would say that that is actually the end of art and the beginning of art theory. And a similar question can be asked with regards to pop art and Andy Warhol. You know, people might look at his can of soup and say, is this art? Damien Hirst, of course, today with his formaldehyde shark, critics derided it by saying, well, anyone could have done that, you know, that classic criticism. And Damien Hirst's response was, well, they didn't, did they? So one objection to art is, this isn't art. And then there's another one, which is the objection that this artwork is somehow immoral. And you have endless examples of this, starting with Christian morality in the Renaissance, reacting to nudity. So Michelangelo's Last Judgment, his great fresco in the Sistine Chapel, not the one on the ceiling, but the one on the wall to the side, depicting Judgment Day and a powerful avenging Christ with all the souls around him, some going to paradise, some going to hell, and all of them are naked. And a cadre of bishops at the time profoundly objected to this immorality, this immodesty in the nudity, and commissioned all of the nudes to be covered by loincloths. So if you go to the Sistine Chapel today, you will see that many of the nude figures on the fresco aren't actually nude, but they have their little wieners covered by added-on loincloths that feel slightly unnatural. And throughout art history, you got all sorts of works that were criticized because of their immorality, starting with Pablo Picasso's depictions of vaginas. You've got a brutal painting called The Guitar Lesson by Balthazar Klossowski. This is a 1930s painting of a woman teaching a young girl guitar lessons, but instead of playing the guitar, the woman is playing the naked little girl. A rather disturbing depiction of what looks like pedophilia. And that painting upsets moral sensitivities to the point where I don't think it's been exhibited since the 70s. So there's all sorts of reasons why people would have a profoundly visceral reaction, and a negative one, to an artwork. And the Rite of Spring, I think, kind of hits that sweet spot of being both, because on the musical scale, there's the whole, this isn't music, it doesn't conform to the aesthetic canons of the genre, at least as established up to that point, but it also offends moral sensitivities of the time, at least, because it depicts sex and violence and human sacrifice. So pretty special in that sense. And all of this reminds me of what's going on right now. You know, we have the Cannes Film Festival over in France, and Lars Von Trier's new film, The House That Jack Built, provoked massive walkouts, with journalists remarking that they'd never seen anything quite like the reaction to that film. I haven't seen the film, but now of course I'm going to because I'm curious. But the film stars Matt Dillon and Uma Thurman, and in it Dillon plays a serial killer who goes around killing and crucially torturing his victims. And I understand that there's a number of very grotesque and violent scenes in it, such as he slices off a woman's breast, he murders children. So I can see why people would have these very strong visceral reactions to the film. And this is something we see every few years, usually with Lars Von Trier, a very controversial director in general. I mean, his last couple of films was, one of them was about an infomaniac, and the other one had Willem Dafoe mutilating his own penis in one scene, so that was quite gross. But it's interesting to see that in this respect not much has changed. Sure, maybe there's no artwork that can offend us to the point where we would go out and stage a massive riot on the streets of Paris, but we might take a course of action that is more immediately available to us, such as start a Twitter storm about it and try to get whoever created the work of art fired, or try to get their work boycotted, or find some other way to damage their reputation and their income. So really, we haven't changed that much since the Puritans who got very pissed off at the Rite of Spring, which is now established as a classic. And I guess that prompts me to two considerations/questions, which go out to you, of course. The first is, have you ever encountered a piece of art, a movie, an album, a book, a painting, that shocked you to your core and provoked such a negative reaction, to the point where you actually felt offended by it? And what was it? Where is your line? What's your threshold on these matters? And the second consideration is this. Considering the stature of works of art like Michelangelo's Last Judgment, some of Caravaggio's works, Picasso's paintings, The Fountain today, and of course the Rite of Spring, considering how today these works are widely acclaimed as masterpieces in their genre, as bona fide classics, when you're having a reaction like that, how does that affect your thinking as to the artwork you found offensive? Could it be that your strong reaction to it might be exactly what contributes to making it a classic? Let me know. If you're listening on Anchor, just use the app to call in, or write me an email. You'll find the address on thegreateverything.com, or hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the usual places. I look forward to hearing your views on this. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Great Everything. Until next time, arrivederci. Hey guys, we're back for some final words, at least for now, on the bombing that took place 2 nights ago at the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. So far, 22 victims, many of whom were children and teenagers. And in the meantime, a suspect, a 23-year-old man named Salman Abedi, has been apprehended, and the UK has raised the terror alert to the highest level of critical, meaning that another attack may be imminent. Happy Wednesday, everyone!